Screw it. Screw time zones. Screw countdowns. Screws and adhesive tape and oil and copper and circuitry. These are things I'll need for upgrades for my guns as I play Fallout 4. As we are playing, well, Fallout 4, but also listening to Legacy of Ashes, History of the CIA, here on Empire of Dirt, a subdivision of Low Energy Videos. I am Low Energy Videos, and I got plenty of sleep. And I woke up at 6 in the evening. Well, 5 something. So I decided in my infinite wisdom, hey, maybe I should go back to sleep. And I couldn't. And it's 3 hours later. So I just said, screw it. Screw it. I'll give you guys your show as promised, as written in the ancient stones. This, of course, will also be uploaded to YouTube. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe over there if you're watching it over there. And check out the links down below for our good friend Mr. Twitch, which will take you to here where you can watch this and other games live. And if you're watching it live here on Twitch, or just afterwards, be sure to go and check out my YouTube, where I do gaming and non-gaming stuff, including exercise, a podcast that sometimes works, drinking streams, and on Wednesday, the start of UFF with Chesh and Krendar for a one-off speckle. Very speckle. Now I have 3 mugs here. I've got a mug of soup, a mug of coffee, and a mug of tea, which I will not be drinking in that order, but I am still preparing them as such. At this point now, you should know what I'm all about. So I'm just going to hit play, and we're going to get into it. As far as I'm aware, game-wise, I did a lot of the basic generic stuff in Diamond City. So we could go and look for Nick. Or we can just bum around and see what... Yeah, we can go to the Burroff brothers and talk to what's-his-name about helping the main radio DJ have some fucking balls. Or we could go and talk to the teacher, I suppose. No one really goes into the schoolhouse. There's not really much else to say other than hope you're all having a fantastic time, and let's get to it.
The agency was trying to put out peace feelers to North Vietnam by returning a politically astute Viet Cong prisoner of war to Hanoi with a clandestine radio transmitter seeking to open talks at the highest levels with the enemy. Nothing had come of it. The CIA had created and run the local Communist Party in several pro-American nations, among them Panama, hoping that the party's leaders would be invited to Moscow and discover the secrets of Soviet doctrine firsthand. The lessons learned in the never-ending battle to penetrate the Kremlin were slim. Helms was trying to mobilize the CIA's first worldwide cadre of deep cover officers, spies who worked without the protection of a diplomatic passport, posing as international lawyers or traveling salesmen for Fortune 500 companies. The program, codenamed Globe, had been underway for 5 years, but barely more than a dozen such officers were wandering the planet.
Well, you can just take all these.
Good operations took years to develop. You have to get the infrastructure, get the people who have to work with you, Helms once explained. There is an enormous amount of plumbing to be put into the structure if it is to have any chance of success. But patience, persistence, money, and cunning alone were not enough to fight communism. Real weapons needed to be placed in the hands of friendly rulers and their CIA-trained secret police and paramilitaries. President Eisenhower had created a one-size-fits-all plan called the Overseas Internal Security Program, run by the CIA in concert with the Pentagon and the State Department. The man who wrote the manifesto for the mission, a democratic, unselfish, often unconditional approach to helping other countries to help themselves, was the agency's own Al Haney, the con artist of the Seoul station and the field commander of Operation Success in Guatemala. Haney proposed to police the world by arming America's third world allies. There have been charges that it is morally wrong for the U.S. to aid undemocratic regimes to strengthen their security systems, thereby serving to entrench them in power, he argued. But the U.S. cannot afford the moral luxury of helping only those regimes in the free world that meet our ideals of self-government. Eliminate all the absolute monarchies, dictatorships, and juntas from the free world, and count those that are left, and it should be readily apparent that the U.S. would be well on its way to isolation. The program trained 771,217 foreign military and police officers in 25 nations. It found the most fertile ground in nations where covert action by the CIA had prepared the soil. It had helped create the secret police of Cambodia, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Iran, Iraq, Laos, Peru, the Philippines, South Korea, South Vietnam, and Thailand. In each of these nations, the interior ministries and the national police worked in close liaison with the CIA station. The agency also established an international police academy in Panama and a bomb school in Los Fresnos, Texas, which trained officers from Central and South America. Graduates included the future leaders of death squads in El Salvador and Honduras. It was sometimes a short step from the classroom to the torture chamber. The CIA was on dangerous ground, said Robert Amory, chief of the CIA's intelligence directorate under Eisenhower and Kennedy. You can get into Gestapo-type tactics. In the 1960s, the scope of the CIA's work expanded dramatically in Latin America. Castro was the catalyst, said Tom Polgar, the Berlin-based veteran who served as chief of the Foreign Intelligence Staff of the Latin American Division from 1965 to 1967. The CIA and the propertied classes of Latin America had that one thing in common, that fear. My mission was to use the Latin American stations as a means to collect intelligence on the Soviet Union and Cuba, Polgar said. To do that, you have to have a relatively stable government that will cooperate with the United States. The CIA was backing the leaders of 11 Latin American nations: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Guyana, Honduras, Nicaragua, Peru, and Venezuela. Once a friendly government was in power, a CIA station chief had 5 paths to maintain American influence over foreign leaders. You become their foreign intelligence service, Polgar said. They don't know what's going on in the world, so you give them a weekly briefing, doctored to meet their sensibilities. Money, definitely, that's always welcome. Procurement, toys, games, weapons. Training, and you can always take a group of officers to Fort Bragg or to Washington. A wonderful holiday. The agency held the position, duly stated in a formal estimate signed by Richard Helms, that Latin American military juntas were good for the United States. They were the only force capable of controlling political crises. Law and order were better than the messy struggle for democracy and freedom. In LBJ's day, the counterinsurgency missions started by the Kennedys took root where Ike's internal security programs had flourished and the CIA had installed military and political allies. In 1967, through the careful cultivation of dictators on 2 continents, the CIA scored one of its greatest Cold War victories, hunting down Che Guevara.
Yep, I read all about that.
Remember, you are killing a man. Che was a living emblem for the soldiers and the spies of the Cuban Revolution. They served in outposts as far-flung as the Congo, where the power of the strongman Joseph Mobutu was threatened by a ragtag rebel force called the Simbas, whose warriors had kidnapped the CIA base chief in Stanleyville in 1964. The Congo was a cockpit of the Cold War, and Mobutu and the CIA worked in closest harmony. Jerry Gossens, the CIA's number 3 man in the Congo, proposed that they create a new force to fight Soviet and Cuban influence in Africa. Mobutu gave me a house, 7 officers, and 6 Volkswagens, and I taught them how to conduct surveillance, Gossens said. We set up a Congolese service reporting to the CIA. We directed them. We ran them. Eventually, with the president's blessing, we paid their operational expenses. I got the take, vetted it, edited it, and passed it on to Mobutu. Mobutu got whatever he wanted from the CIA, money and guns, planes and pilots, a personal physician, and the political security of close liaison with the American government, while the CIA built its bases and stations in the heart of Africa. In a classic battle of the Cold War, Che and his Cubans confronted the CIA and its Cubans on the western shores of Lake Tanganyika in the heart of Africa. The agency's forces, equipped with recoilless rifles and warplanes, attacked several thousand Simbas and about 100 of Che's Cuban soldiers. Under fire, Che sought new orders from Fidel. Avoid annihilation, El Jefe Maximo advised. Che made an inglorious retreat. On the run, he crossed the Atlantic, seeking to light the flames of revolution in Latin America. He wound up in the mountains of Bolivia, where the CIA tracked him down. A right-wing general, René Barrientos, had seized power in that desperately poor nation, backed by more than $1 million from the CIA. The money served to encourage, in the agency's words, a stable government favorably inclined toward the United States, and in support of the ruling junta's plans to pacify the country. The general crushed his opponents with increasing force. Bill Brough, chief of the Latin American division of the clandestine service, wrote to Helms with satisfaction, with the election of René Barrientos as president of Bolivia on July 3, 1966, this action was brought to a successful completion. The CIA sent its Barrientos file to the White House. National Security Advisor Walt Rostow handed it to the president and said, "This is to explain why General Barrientos may say thank you when you have lunch with him next Wednesday, the 20th. In April 1967, Barrientos told the American ambassador, Douglas Henderson, that his officers were tracking Che in the mountains of Bolivia. Ambassador Henderson was headed for Washington that week, and he had brought the news to Desmond Fitzgerald.
This is about the only book I'm reading right now, except for one on Henry VIII.
Fitzgerald had said, "We think that Che Guevara was killed in the Dominican Republic and is buried in an unmarked grave." Nevertheless, the CIA sent 2 Cuban veterans of the Bay of Pigs down to join the hunt with a squad of American-trained Bolivian Rangers. One of the CIA's Cubans was Feliz Rodriguez, and he sent a series of stirring bulletins from the battlefront. His messages, declassified in 2004, are the only contemporary eyewitness accounts of a confrontation long shrouded by myth. From the village of Higueras, Rodriguez radioed John Tilton, the station chief in La Paz, who relayed the news to Bill Brough and Tom Polgar at headquarters. Their reports went to Helms, who hand-carried them to the White House. On October 8, 1967, Che was captured after a clash with the Bolivian Rangers. He had a wound in his leg but was otherwise in fair condition. His
was a bad
dreams
call
of
going to
making a
Bolivia.
Vietnam in South America had evaporated in the thin air of the Bolivian highlands. His captors took him to a little schoolhouse. Rodriguez learned that the Bolivian High Command in La Paz would decide Che's fate on the following day. "I am managing to keep him alive," Rodriguez reported, "which is very hard." At daybreak the following morning, Rodriguez tried to interrogate Che, who was sitting on the schoolhouse floor, his face in his hands, his wrists and ankles bound, the corpses of 2 Cuban compañeros beside him. They talked about the clash in the Congo and the course of the Cuban Revolution. Che said that Castro had killed no more than 1,500 of his political enemies, apart from armed conflicts such as the Bay of Pigs. The Cuban government, of course, executed all guerrilla leaders who invaded its territory, Che said, according to Rodriguez. He stopped then with a quizzical look on his face and smiled as he recognized his own position on Bolivian soil. Rodriguez continued, "With his capture, the guerrilla movement had suffered an overwhelming setback. He insisted that his ideals would win in the end.
Yep.
He had not planned an exfiltration route from Bolivia in case of failure. He had definitely decided to fail or win." The High Command sent the order to kill Che at 11:50 a.m. Guevara was executed with a burst of shots at 1:15 p.m., Rodriguez radioed to Tilton. Guevara's last words were, "Tell my wife to remarry, and tell Fidel Castro that the revolution will rise again in the Americas." To his executioner, he said, "Remember, you are killing a man." Tom Polgar was the duty officer at headquarters when Tilton called in the news that Che was dead.
They were all a little bit scared
"Can you send
of killing him.
fingerprints?" Polgar asked.
They weren't sure what was going to happen.
"I can send fingers," Tilton replied.
Except for Che.
Che's
He knew.
executioners
The man would die.
had cut off his hands. Paramount considerations must be political sensitivity. There were few such triumphs to trumpet for Helms and his officers. They were outnumbered by a multitude of mistakes. Once again, CIA operations have created a major problem. The State Department's Egypt desk informed Luke Battle, the new Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. Egypt's ruler, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was complaining, not for the first time and not without cause, that the agency was trying to overthrow his government. "CIA appears to hope that these incidents can be swept under the rug," said the message to Battle. "This should not be allowed to happen." Battle knew what the CIA's work in Egypt entailed. He had been the American ambassador when a happy-go-lucky case officer carelessly exposed the agency's relationship with a prominent Cairo newspaper editor named Mustafa Amin. Amin had been close to Nasser. The CIA paid him for information and for publishing pro-American news reports. The Cairo station chief had lied to the ambassador about the agency's relationship with Amin. He had been on the U.S. payroll, Battle said. Bruce Odell, the CIA case officer, had been meeting regularly with Mustafa Amin. "I had been assured that no funds had been exchanged in Egypt, but a photograph of such a transaction was made when Mustafa Amin was arrested." The case made headlines around the world, prominently featuring Odell, who had worked under diplomatic cover. Amin was tried as a spy, brutally tortured, and imprisoned for 9 years. Helms tried to build confidence in the CIA. He had hoped that President Johnson would come out to Langley, Virginia, to address the troops at headquarters in September 1967 during ceremonies marking the agency's 20th anniversary. But LBJ never once visited the CIA. He sent Vice President Humphrey for the ceremony, and Humphrey delivered a characteristically thumbs-up speech. "You will be criticized," he said. "The only people who aren't criticized are those who do nothing, and I would hate to see the agency get in that state." The CIA could not survive sustained criticism from within the government, much less from the public. It depended on secrecy to survive. When blown operations wound up in the newspapers, it eroded what faith remained in the agency. On September 30th, 1967, Helms laid out strict new guidelines for covert action and sent them to every station. For the first time in the history of the CIA, station chiefs and their superiors were instructed to err on the side of caution. Review all projects which are politically sensitive, the order said. Inform headquarters of the identities of foreign politicians, both governmental and opposition, as well as certain military leaders on the U.S. covert payroll. No sum of money spent on covert action was too small to report. Our paramount considerations must be the political sensitivity of the activity and its consistency with U.S. foreign policy. The flow of cash to burned-out foreign agents, third-rate newspapers, also-ran political parties, and other unproductive operations began to dry up. The number of major political warfare operations in Western Europe began to dwindle. The CIA would stay focused on the hot war in Southeast Asia and the Cold War in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. But there was a war going on at home as well. The president had just told Helms to undertake the most politically sensitive operation of all, the job of spying on Americans. 27. Track down the foreign communists. President Johnson feared that the anti-war movement would drive him out of the White House. But in the end, the war itself did it. In October 1967, a handful of CIA analysts joined in the first big Washington march against the war. The president regarded the protesters as enemies of the state. He was convinced that the peace movement was controlled and financed by Moscow and Beijing. He wanted proof.
They tried.
He ordered Richard Helms to produce it. Helms reminded the president that the CIA was barred from spying on Americans. He says Johnson told him, "I'm quite aware of that. What I want for you is to pursue this matter and to do what is necessary to track down the foreign communists who are behind this intolerable interference in our domestic affairs." It is likely that LBJ expressed himself more plainly. In a blatant violation of his powers under law, the director of Central Intelligence became a part-time secret police chief. The CIA undertook a domestic surveillance operation codenamed Chaos. It went on for almost 7 years. Helms created a new special operations group to run the spying on Americans, and he cannily hid it in the shadows of Angleton's counterintelligence staff. 11 CIA officers grew long hair, learned the jargon of the New Left, and went off to infiltrate peace groups in the United States and Europe.
Baby.
The agency compiled a computer index of 300,000 names of American people and organizations, and extensive files on 7,200 citizens. It began working in secret with police departments all over America. Unable to draw a clear distinction between the far left and the mainstream opposition to the war, it spied on every major organization in the peace movement. At the president's command, transmitted through Helms and the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Agency turned its immense eavesdropping powers on American citizens. Both the president and the conservatives in Congress saw connections between the peace protests and the race riots rocking the United States. They wanted the CIA to prove that communists were behind them both. The agency tried its best. In 1967, American ghettos had become war zones. 75 separate urban riots racked the nation, resulting in 88 deaths, 1,397 injuries, 16,389 arrests, 2,157 convictions, and economic damage estimated at $664.5 million. 43 people had been killed in Detroit, 26 in Newark. Rage filled the streets of New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Cincinnati, Dayton, Cleveland, Youngstown, Toledo, Peoria, Des Moines, Wichita, Birmingham, and Tampa. On October 25th, Senator John McClellan, an Arkansas Democrat and chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, wrote to Helms seeking evidence that the Soviets were running the Black Power movement in the United States. The subcommittee is very much interested in the operations of various militant organizations in this country, the senator wrote.
I want that.
McClellan said that Moscow had created an espionage or sabotage school in Ghana, Africa, for colored people, and that Americans had served as instructors. Purportedly, these teachers came from somewhere in California, the senator wrote. It would be most helpful to the subcommittee if the identity of any American teacher who returned to the United States were known, as well as the identity of any student. Your cooperation in this matter will indeed be appreciated. The clandestine service cooperated. On October 31st, 1967, Tom Karamessines sent a raw and unconfirmed rumor from a Miami Cuban to the White House. A Negro training camp had been established at a beach near Santiago de Cuba, where Negroes were being trained for subversive operations against the United States, the report said. Their courses included English, which was being taught by Soviet instructors.
Wow,
it continued. Their subversive activities against the United States would include sabotage in connection with race riots directed at bringing a Negro revolution in the United States. It said that 150 Negroes are involved in the training program, and some have already arrived in the United States.
And it's
Lyndon
accurate
Johnson
for
was
what they
enraged.
said.
I'm not going to let the communists take this government. And they're doing it right now, he told Helms, Rusk, and McNamara during a 95-minute rant on a Saturday afternoon, November 4th, 1967. I've got my belly full of seeing these people put on a communist plane and shipped all over this country. I want someone to carefully look at who leaves this country, where they go, why they are going. This last remark was aimed pointedly at Helms. But the CIA never found a shred of evidence that linked the leaders of the American left or the Black Power movement to foreign governments. Helms took this unhappy fact to the president on November 15, 1967. He reported that while the CIA suspected that some members of the American left might have ideological affinities with Moscow or Hanoi, no evidence showed that they act under any direction other than their own. Lyndon Johnson ordered Helms to intensify the search. It produced nothing beyond a continuing violation of the CIA's charter. For millions of Americans, the war came home every night on television. On January 31st, 1968, 400,000 communist troops hit almost every major city and military garrison in South Vietnam. The attack came on the first night of Tet, the Lunar New Year, and the enemy laid siege to Saigon and the major American bases at Hue and Khe Sanh. On February 1st, television and still cameras captured the Saigon police chief as he executed a Viet Cong prisoner in cold blood with a pistol shot to the head.
Oh yeah, that's a
The
famous
assault
picture.
went on and on. Though the American counterattack was overwhelming, 100,000 tons of bombs fell around Khe Sanh alone. The shock of the surprise attack was a devastating psychological defeat for the United States.
At all.
Helms concluded that the CIA
need to be.
could not have predicted the Tet offensive because it had next to no intelligence on the enemy's intent. On February 11th, 1968, Helms pulled all his Vietnam experts together at headquarters. All but one of them, George Carver, still an optimist, though not for long, agreed on the following points. General Westmoreland, the American commander in Saigon, had no coherent strategy. It was useless to send more American troops. If the government and the Army of South Vietnam did not pull together and fight the enemy, the United States should get out.
Yep.
Helms sent George Allen back to Saigon to assess the damage and to meet with President Thieu and Vice President Key. Allen found the Army of South Vietnam shattered and the two leaders at one another's throats. American soldiers were unable to defend the nation's cities. American spies were panicked and demoralized. Hanoi had won its greatest political victory since 1954, when it handed the French their final defeat at Dien Bien Phu.
Again,
Helms personally gave the president the
planned for it to
deeply
work out that way.
pessimistic conclusions. They destroyed all but the last of LBJ's enormous political will. On February 19th, as Hanoi mounted a second wave of Tet attacks, the president spoke privately with Dwight Eisenhower. The next day, at the Tuesday lunch at the White House, Helms listened as the president described the conversation. General Eisenhower said that Westmoreland carries more responsibility than any general in the history of this country, LBJ recounted. I asked him how many allies he had under his command during World War II. He said, including U.S. and Allied troops, he had about 5 million. I told him General Westmoreland had 500,000 men, so how could he say that Westmoreland had the greatest responsibility of any American general? He said it was a different kind of war, and General Westmoreland doesn't know who the enemy is. At last, Lyndon Johnson understood that no strategy could survive the failure of intelligence in Vietnam.
Yeah.
The United States could not defeat an enemy it could not understand. A few weeks later, he announced he would not seek re-election as the President of the United States. Part 4. Get rid of the clowns. The CIA under Nixon and Ford, 1968 to 1976.
Oh, we're getting
28.
into the meat and potatoes
What
of
the
it.
hell do those clowns do out there in Langley? In the spring of 1968, Richard Helms had good reason to fear that his next boss would be either Robert Kennedy or Richard Nixon. As Attorney General, Kennedy had abused the powers of the agency. He had commandeered the CIA and treated Helms with cold disdain. As a candidate or as a commander-in-chief, he would be threatened by the secrets in the agency's files. Helms was truly shocked when the senator was murdered on the campaign trail in June, but he was not truly saddened. For the rest of his life, Helms bore lasting scars from the lashings Kennedy had laid on him. Richard Nixon was another problem altogether. Helms knew how deep his resentments ran. Nixon thought the agency was filled with Eastern elitists, knee-jerk liberals, Georgetown gossips.
You don't like
Kennedy
you there,
men.
Nixon?
It was an open secret that Nixon held the CIA responsible for the greatest disaster in his life, his defeat in the 1960 election. He was convinced, wrongly, that secrets and lies
Man never
leaked by
drank a
Allen
duff in his life.
Dulles had helped John Kennedy score crucial points in the televised presidential debates. In his 1962 memoir, 6 Crises, Nixon had written that if he had been elected president, he would have created a new organization outside the CIA for carrying out covert operations. It was an open threat to cut out the agency's heart. On August 10, 1968, Nixon and Helms met for their first long talk.
Shit.
The president had invited the candidate down to the LBJ ranch in Texas, fed him steak and corn on the cob, and drove him around the ranch in an open convertible. Then he turned to Helms for a tour of the world. The confrontation between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, Castro's continuing support for revolutionary movements, and finally the secret peace negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam. Nixon turned directly to Helms with a pointed question. "Do they still believe we have lost the war?" he asked. "The North Vietnamese are convinced they won after Dien Bien Phu," Helms said. That was the last thing Nixon wanted to hear. 3 days after winning the election, Nixon placed a call to LBJ. "What do you think about Helms?" he asked. "Would you continue him?" "Yes, I would," Johnson replied. "He's extremely competent. He's succinct. He tells you as it is, and he's loyal."
No conservative wants to
That
hear
was
that.
high praise. After a year and a half dining at the president's table, Helms had won LBJ's confidence and earned a reputation in Washington as a consummate professional. He believed that the
Consummate.
CIA, after 20 years, had developed a cadre of analysts with unique expertise on the Soviet threat and a clandestine service capable of conducting espionage without getting caught. He saw himself as a loyal soldier in the service of his president. Helms would soon find out the cost of that loyalty. Incurably covert. Richard Nixon never trusted anybody, Helms reflected 20 years later. Here he had become President of the United States and therefore Chief of the Executive Branch, and yet he was constantly telling people that the Air Force in their bombings in Vietnam couldn't hit their ass with their hand. The State Department was just a bunch of pinstriped, cocktail-drinking diplomats. that the agency couldn't come up with a winning victory in Vietnam. On and on and on. They are dumb, they are stupid, they can't do this and they can't do that. At the White House in January 1969, a few days into the new administration, Helms sat in tense silence at lunch as Nixon picked at his cottage cheese and canned pineapple. The president ripped into the CIA while his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, listened attentively. I haven't the slightest doubt, Helms recalled, that Nixon's carping affected Kissinger. The president-elect and the Harvard man had discovered they were kindred spirits. Both were incurably covert, but Kissinger was charming about it, observed Thomas Hughes, the director of the State Department's Intelligence Bureau. Both were inveterate manipulators, but Nixon was more transparent. They had reached an understanding. They alone would conceive, command, and control clandestine operations. Covert action and espionage could be tools fitted for their personal use. Nixon used them to build a political fortress at the White House, and Kissinger became, in the words of his aide, Roger Morris, the acting chief of state for national security. As a preemptive act of self-protection, Helms had created a committee of wise men called the Covert Operations Study Group to report to the president-elect on the value of the clandestine service and to protect it from attack. The group was led by Franklin Lindsay, once Frank Wisner's right-hand man, housed at Harvard and convened in secret. Its foremost members were Richard Bissell and Lyman Kirkpatrick. It included half a dozen Harvard professors who had served the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA. 3 of them were close enough to their colleague Henry Kissinger to know he would be the next president's national security advisor, no matter who won the race. For Kissinger had simultaneously served both Nixon and Humphrey as a confidential consultant. Neither man ever considered anyone else for the job. The Covert Operations Study Group's secret report was dated December 1st, 1968. One of its recommendations particularly pleased Kissinger. It said the new president should give one senior White House official responsibility for watching over all covert operations. Kissinger would not merely watch them, he would run them. The report urged the new president to make it very clear to the director of the CIA that he expects him to say no when, in the director's judgment, a proposed operation cannot be done. Nixon never heeded that advice. Covert operations can rarely achieve an important objective alone, the report continued. At best, a covert operation can win time, forestall a coup, or otherwise create favorable conditions which will make it possible to use overt means to finally achieve an important objective. Nixon never understood this principle. An individual, a political party, or a government in office can be seriously injured or destroyed by exposure of covert assistance from CIA, the report said. On balance, exposure of clandestine operations costs the United States in terms of world opinion. To some, exposure demonstrates the disregard of the United States for national rights and human rights. To others, it demonstrates only our impotence and ineptness in getting caught. The impression of many Americans, especially in the intellectual community and among the youth, that the United States is engaging in dirty tricks tends to alienate them from their government, the report continued. Disclosures in this atmosphere have created opportunities for the new left to affect a much wider spectrum of political opinion than otherwise would have been the case. The United States has been in the forefront of those nations concerned with expanding the rule of law in international affairs. Our credibility and our effectiveness in this role is necessarily damaged to the extent that it becomes known that we are secretly intervening in what may be or appear to be the internal affairs of others. Nixon and Kissinger willfully ignored all these ideas. It is our impression that CIA has become much too ingrown over the years, the report concluded. Nearly all of the senior people have been in the organization on the order of 20 years. There also is a strong tendency toward isolation and inwardness. a lack of innovativeness and perspective. This much Nixon believed. He set out to infiltrate that inner circle. He began by naming Marine Lieutenant General Robert Cushman, who had been his national security aide when he was vice president, as the deputy director of Central Intelligence under Helms. Cushman's mission was to spy on America's spies for the president. Eager to curry favor with the president-elect, the CIA sent Nixon the same daily intelligence summaries that Lyndon Johnson had received. They piled up unread in a safe at Nixon's suite on the 39th floor at the Pierre Hotel in New York. The stack grew for a month, until Kissinger sent word in December that Nixon would never look at them. He made it clear that from now on, anything the agency wanted to tell the president would have to be channeled through him. Neither Helms nor anyone else from the CIA would ever see Nixon alone. From the start, Kissinger exerted an ever-tightening control over the CIA's operations. In 1967 and 1968, the CIA's overseers at the 303 Committee had lively debates over the course of covert action. Those days were gone. Kissinger dominated every other member of the committee: Helms, Attorney General John Mitchell, and the number 2 officers of the State Department and the Pentagon. It became a one-man show. During a 32-month stretch, the committee technically approved nearly 40 covert actions, but never once actually convened. In all, more than 3/4 of the covert action programs of the Nixon administration never were considered formally by the committee. The black operations of the United States were approved by Henry Kissinger. In 1969, as is well known, the president wiretapped private citizens to stop news leaks and to control the flow of information inside the government. His national security advisor went beyond that. Kissinger also used the CIA to spy on Americans.
I don't think he's a crook, though.
That heretofore has escaped the attention of history. After the anti-war movement called for a monthly national moratorium, a one-day suspension of American business as usual, Helms received an order from Kissinger to spy on its leaders. Recorded in the office diary of Robert L. Bannerman, a senior staff member in the CIA's Office of Security, the memo was titled, "Dr. Kissinger, Information Request." Dr. Kissinger levied a request as to what information we have on the leaders of the groups that conducted the moratorium on Vietnam, the CIA memo reads. After consideration, this request was relayed to, deleted, who agreed to be the focal point for this report, and work on this report was conducted over the weekend. This was not merely a continuation of chaos, the CIA's ongoing search for sources of foreign support for the anti-war movement. It was a specific request from the President's National Security Advisor for CIA files on American citizens. The record reflects no hesitation on the part of Richard Helms. Since 1962, 3 successive presidents had ordered the Director of Central Intelligence to spy on Americans, regardless of the CIA's charter. Nixon believed that all presidential action is legal in the realm of national security. If the president does it, he said, it is not illegal. Among his successors, only George W. Bush fully embraced this interpretation of presidential power, rooted in the divine right of kings. But it was one thing for a president to issue such an order, and quite another for an unelected official to do so in the president's name. Hit the Soviets and hit them hard. Nixon and Kissinger operated at a level of clandestinity beyond the CIA's. When they dealt with the enemies of the United States, negotiating in secret with the Soviets, the Chinese, the North Vietnamese, the CIA knew little or nothing about it. There was a reason for that. The White House disbelieved much of what the CIA's experts said about the forces of communism, especially the agency's estimates of the military might of the Soviet Union. I don't mean to say that they are lying about the intelligence or distorting it, but I want you fellows to be very careful to separate facts from opinions, Nixon told Helms at a June 18, 1969 National Security Council meeting. The fact is that the intelligence projections for 1965, 1966, 1967, and 1968, and I've seen them all, have been up to 50% off in what the Russians were going to have, and on the low side, Nixon said. We have got to start with fact and all the facts and reach the conclusions on the basis of hard fact. Is that understood now? Nixon was outraged when the agency argued that the Soviets had neither the intention nor the technology to launch a knockout nuclear first strike. That conclusion came in a flurry of formal estimates on Soviet strategic forces, all of which Nixon rejected. Useless, he wrote in the margins of a memo from Helms on Moscow's nuclear capabilities. A superficial, mindless recitation of what we know from the daily press. The CIA's analyses flew in the face of Nixon's plans to build an anti-ballistic missile system, the prelude to the Star Wars fantasies of the future. Whose side is the agency on, was the way Helms remembered the White House argument. In other words, let's all get together and trim the evidence. In the end, that is exactly what Helms did, erasing a key passage of the CIA's most important estimate on Soviet nuclear forces in 1969. Once again, the agency was tailoring its work to fit the pattern of White House policy. His decision to go along with the White House did not sit well with the agency analysts, Helms recorded. In their view, I had compromised one of the agency's fundamental responsibilities, the mandate to evaluate all available data and express conclusions irrespective of U.S. policies. But Helms would not risk this battle. I was convinced we would have lost the argument with the Nixon administration, and that in the process the agency would have been permanently damaged. His analysts complained about the suppression of dissent and the failure to learn from past mistakes, but no plan to improve the analysis of Soviet capabilities and intentions came forth. The CIA had been studying spy satellite reconnaissance photos of the Soviet Union for 8 years now, looking down from space and putting together a jigsaw puzzle of the Soviet military. The agency was working on the next generation of spy satellites to be equipped with television cameras. Helms always had believed that gadgets were no replacement for spies. Nevertheless, he assured Nixon that they would give the United States the power to make sure that Moscow complied with agreements reached in SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks then underway in Helsinki. But the more raw data the CIA obtained on the Soviet military, the less clear the big picture became. Nixon rightly criticized the agency for having underestimated Soviet nuclear firepower in the 1960s. He pounded the agency on that account throughout his presidency. The result of that pressure is now evident. For 13 years, from Nixon's era to the dying days of the Cold War, every estimate of Soviet strategic nuclear forces overstated the rate at which Moscow was modernizing its weaponry.
Yep.
Nixon nonetheless relied on the CIA to subvert the Soviet Union at every turn, not just in Moscow, but in every nation on earth. The President called Henry Kissinger and me into the Oval Office after the NSC meeting today for what turned out to be a 25-minute discussion of a variety of subjects, including SALT, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, and black operations, Helms recorded in a March 25, 1970 memo. With respect to black operations, the President enjoined me to hit the Soviets and hit them hard any place we can in the world. He said to just go ahead, to keep Henry Kissinger informed, and to be as imaginative as we could. He was as emphatic on this as I have ever heard him on anything. Encouraged by this rare moment of presidential attention, Helms took this moment to hit hard on the point that I felt strongly the United States should give up nothing which constituted a pressure on the Soviet Union or an irritation to them without exacting a specific price in return. He promised the President a new array of proposed covert actions against the Soviets. Only one paragraph of the paper Helms sent to the White House the next week caught Nixon's eye. Helms reviewed the work of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, a 20-year investment of more than $400 million, and the power of the radios to keep the fires of dissent alive behind the Iron Curtain. He detailed the work of Soviet dissidents, such as the physicist Andrei Sakharov and the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose words had been played back to the Soviet Union by the CIA. 30 million people in Eastern Europe heard Radio Free Europe, and Soviet citizens did their best to tune in Radio Liberty, though Moscow was spending $150 million a year jamming their signals. In addition, the Free Europe and Liberty organizations had distributed 2.5 million books and periodicals in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe since the late 1950s. The hope was that words, on the air and in print, could promote intellectual and cultural freedom. All that was good, but it was also old hat to Nixon. What captured his imagination was the CIA's ability to swing elections. There have been numerous instances when facing the threat of a Communist Party or Popular Front election victory in the free world, we have met the threat and turned it successfully, Helms reminded the president. Guyana in 1963 and Chile in 1964 are good examples of what can be accomplished under difficult circumstances. Similar situations may soon face us in various parts of the world, and we are prepared for action with carefully planned covert election programs. That was more like it. Money and politics were subjects close to Nixon's heart. The only way to go was the old way. The agency had secretly supported politicians in Western Europe throughout the Cold War. The list included Chancellor Willy Brandt of Germany, Prime Minister Guy Mollet of France, and every Christian Democrat who ever won a national election in Italy. The CIA had spent 20 years and at least $65 million buying influence in Rome and Milan and Naples. In 1965, McGeorge Bundy had called the covert action program in Italy the annual shame, yet it went on. Foreign powers had been meddling in Italian politics for centuries. Washington was following in the tradition of what the fascists, the communists, the Nazis, the British, and the French had done before, said Thomas Fina, the American consul general in Milan under Nixon and a veteran of American intelligence and diplomacy in Italy. The CIA had been subsidizing political parties, withdrawing money from political parties, giving money to individual politicians, not giving it to other politicians, subsidizing the publication of books, the content of radio programs, subsidizing newspapers, subsidizing journalists, Fina noted. It had financial resources, political resources, friends, the ability to blackmail. Nixon and Kissinger revived that tradition. Their instrument was the CIA's Rome station and the extraordinary ambassador Graham Martin. Kissinger called Martin that cold-eyed fellow, and he meant it as a compliment. He obviously admired somebody who could be as ruthless in the exercise of power as he could be, said Martin's chief political officer in Rome, Robert Barber. Other American diplomats found Martin shadowy and strange, slippery as a cold basket of eels.
Great.
Martin had converted Marshall Plan funds to CIA cash at the American Embassy in Paris 20 years before. He had worked closely with the CIA as ambassador in Thailand from 1965 to 1968. No American diplomat was more deeply enamored of covert operations. Nixon thought he was terrific. I have great personal confidence in Graham Martin, he told Kissinger on February 14, 1969. And with that, the machine was in motion. Martin's appointment as ambassador in Italy was the handiwork of a wealthy right-wing American named Pier Talenti, who lived in Rome, where he had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the 1968 Nixon campaign among his friends and political allies. That opened the door to the White House. Talenti went to see Colonel Alexander M. Haig, Jr., Kissinger's military aide, to deliver a warning that the socialists were on the verge of taking power in Italy and a proposal that a new American ambassador was needed to counter the left. He named Martin, and his message went right to the top. Martin had persuaded Nixon and Kissinger that he was just the man because he was tough as nails, to bring about a shift in Italian politics, said Wells Stabler, his deputy chief of mission in Rome. Martin decided that the only way to go was the old way, said Stabler, who became a reluctant participant in the revival of American covert action in Italy.
Combat armor.
Beginning in 1970, after receiving formal approval from the Nixon White House, Martin oversaw the distribution of $25 million to both Christian Democrats and Italian neo-fascists, Stabler said. The money was divided in the back room, the CIA station inside the palatial American embassy, by the ambassador, myself, and the station chief, Stabler said. Some was given to the parties, some to individuals. Sometimes the station chief or myself would recommend something, but it was the ambassador who would give the approval. The station chief was Rocky Stone, the veteran of the Iran coup and the blown attempt to overthrow Syria, who had come to Rome after 3 years as chief of operations for the Soviet division. Stone handed out about $6 million to the mainstream Christian Democrats. Millions more went to committees that pushed ultra-conservative policies in the party, Stabler said.
You went to the wrong building.
And millions more went to a far-right underground. The money, as Martin had promised, transformed the political face of Italy. The man he backed, Giulio Andreotti, won an election infused with the CIA's cash. But the covert financing of the far right fueled a failed neo-fascist coup in 1970. The money helped finance right-wing covert operations, including terrorist bombings, which Italian intelligence blamed on the extreme left. It also led to the worst political scandal in post-war Italy. Parliamentary investigations found that General Vito Miceli, the chief of the Italian Military Intelligence Service, had taken at least $800,000 of the CIA's cash. Miceli was jailed for trying to take over the country by force. Andreotti, the most durable Italian politician in decades, spent the last years of his life fighting criminal charges, including murder. The CIA's days of buying political influence in Italy finally ended when Graham Martin left Rome to become the next and the last American ambassador to South Vietnam.
Die, Blue Man.
This book is continued on Disc 11. Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner, continued. Disc 11. We are conscious of what is at stake. Throughout 1969 and 1970, Nixon and Kissinger focused the CIA on the secret expansion of the war in Southeast Asia. They ordered the agency to make $725,000 in political payoffs to President Thieu of South Vietnam, manipulate the media in Saigon, fix an election in Thailand, and step up covert commando raids in North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In a bleak dispatch on the eve of a world tour that took Nixon across Southeast Asia, Helms told the president about the CIA's long war in Laos. The agency maintained a covert irregular force of a total of 39,000 men, which has borne a major share of the active fighting against the communists, he reminded Nixon. They were the CIA's Hmong fighters, led since 1960 by General Vang Pao. These irregular forces are tired from 8 years of constant warfare, and Vang Pao has been forced to use 13- and 14-year-old children to replace his casualties. The limits have largely been reached on what this agency can do in a paramilitary sense to stop the North Vietnamese advance. Nixon responded by ordering Helms to create a new Thai paramilitary battalion in Laos to shore up the Hmong. Kissinger asked where it would be best to bomb Laos with B-52s. While their clandestine war in Southeast Asia intensified, Nixon and Kissinger made plans for a secret rapprochement with Chairman Mao Zedong. To clear the way to China, they strangled the agency's operations against the communist regime.
All right.
Over the past decade, in the name of combating Chinese communism, the CIA had spent tens of millions of dollars parachuting tons of weapons to hundreds of Tibetan guerrillas who fought for their spiritual leader, His Holiness Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. When Allen Dulles and Desmond Fitzgerald briefed Eisenhower on the operation in February 1960, the president wondered whether the net result of these operations would not be more brutal repressive reprisals by the Chinese communists.
Yep.
Ike approved the program nonetheless. The agency set up a training camp for the Tibetan fighters in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It had paid an annual subsidy of some $180,000 directly to the Dalai Lama, and it created Tibet houses in New York and Geneva to serve as his unofficial embassies. The goal was to keep the dream of a free Tibet alive while harassing the Red Army in western China. The results to date had been dozens of dead resistance fighters and one blood-stained satchel of invaluable Chinese military documents seized in a firefight. In August 1969, the agency requested $2.5 million more to support Tibet's insurgents in the coming year, calling the 1,800-man paramilitary group
take your time.
a force which could be employed in strength in the event of hostilities against China. Does this have any direct benefit to us? Kissinger asked. He answered his own question. Though the CIA's subsidy to the Dalai Lama continued, the Tibetan resistance was abandoned. Kissinger then scuttled the remains of the CIA's 20-year mission to conduct clandestine operations against China. The commando raids of the Korean War had dwindled down to desultory radio broadcasts from Taipei and Seoul, leaflets dropped on the mainland, fake news planted in Hong Kong and Tokyo, and what the agency described as activities worldwide to denigrate and obstruct the People's Republic of China. The CIA kept working with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in his doomed effort to free Taiwan, unaware that Nixon and Kissinger had plans to sit down with Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in Beijing. When Kissinger finally sat down with Zhou, the Prime Minister asked about the latest Free Taiwan campaign. The CIA had no hand in it.
Get that out of the way.
Kissinger assured Zhou that he vastly overestimates the competence of the CIA. They have become the topic of discussion throughout the world, Zhou said. Whenever something happens in the world, they are always thought of. That is true, Kissinger replied, and it flatters them. But they don't deserve it. Zhou was fascinated to learn that Kissinger personally approved the CIA's covert operations. He voiced his suspicions that the agency was still subverting the People's Republic. Kissinger replied that most CIA officers write long, incomprehensible reports and don't make revolution. You use the word revolution, Zhou said. We say subversion. Or subversion, Kissinger conceded. I understand. We are conscious of what is at stake in our relationship, and we will not let one organization carry out petty operations that could hinder this course. That was the end of that. The CIA was out of business in China for years to come. Democracy doesn't work. The CIA fought on every front to shore up the war in Vietnam. One of its bigger efforts came to fruition 3 weeks after President Nixon took office. In February 1969, covert action created the appearance of democracy in Thailand. A military junta had ruled Thailand for 11 years, and tens of thousands of American troops readied for battle against Hanoi at Thai military bases. The dictatorship did little to support the notion that Americans were fighting for democracy in Southeast Asia. The CIA's election operation, code-named Lotus, was a straight cash campaign first conceived by Ambassador Graham Martin in 1965, approved by President Johnson, and reaffirmed by President Nixon. The CIA station in Bangkok coaxed the junta toward holding a ballot. The generals kept putting them off. Finally, the agency pumped millions of dollars into the politics of Thailand in 1968 and 1969. The cash financed the apparent transformation of the uniformed military into a ruling party ready to stand for elections. The CIA's bagman was Pote Saracen, Thailand's ambassador to the United States from 1952 to 1957, the head of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization from 1957 to 1964, and the leading civilian frontman for the ruling junta. The election came off, and the ruling junta won handily. But the rulers grew impatient with the trappings of democracy. They soon ended the experiment, suspending the constitution and disbanding parliament. Pote Saracen reassumed his position as the civilian face of martial law on the night of the bloodless coup, and he brought the generals to explain themselves to their friends at the American embassy in Bangkok that evening. They said they respected the principles of democracy and had tried to put them into action, but they said it was clear that in Thailand today, democracy doesn't work. The CIA's covert action had been the thinnest veneer. There should be no change in Thai relations with the U.S., Kissinger told Nixon after the coup. The leaders of the Revolutionary Council are in fact essentially the same ones with whom we have been dealing all along, he said. We can anticipate that our programs in Thailand will continue without interruption. Get the CIA jerks working. In February 1970, the president urgently ordered the agency to get going in Cambodia. After a year of planning, his secret bombing campaign against suspected Viet Cong targets in that technically neutral nation was set to begin on March 17th. American B-52s would drop 108,823 tons of bombs on 6 suspected communist camps that the CIA and the Pentagon had identified incorrectly as North Vietnam's hidden command center. Helms was trying to lay the foundations for a new CIA station in Cambodia when the nation's right-wing Prime Minister, Lon Nol, seized power. The overthrow came on the day that the secret bombings began. The coup shocked the CIA and the rest of the American government. "What the hell do those clowns do out there in Langley?" Nixon thundered. "Get the CIA jerks working on Cambodia," he commanded. He told Helms to ship thousands of AK-47 automatic rifles to Lon Nol, to print 1 million propaganda leaflets, and to spread the word throughout the world that the United States was ready to invade. Then he ordered the CIA to deliver $10 million to the new Cambodian leader. "Get the money to Lon Nol," he insisted. Nixon had demanded an accurate tally of the arms and ammunition flowing to the enemy through the Cambodian port of Sihanoukville. The agency had been working on the question for 5 years without success. Nixon suggested that the arms flow could be cut off if the CIA bribed the right Cambodian generals. Helms demurred on practical grounds. The generals were making millions off the arms trade, and the agency did not have the funds to buy or rent their loyalties. The argument did not impress the president. At a July 18, 1970 meeting with his Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Nixon savaged the agency's performance. CIA had described the flow of materials through Sihanoukville as only a trickle, he said. In fact, the port was providing 2/3 of the communist arms in Cambodia. If such mistakes could be made on a fairly straightforward issue such as this one, he asked, how should we judge CIA's assessments on more important developments? The U.S. is spending $6 billion per year on intelligence and deserves to get a lot more than it is getting, Nixon said. The Intelligence Board's minutes record his growing rage. The president said he could not put up with people lying to him about intelligence. If intelligence is inadequate, or if the intelligence depicts a bad situation, he wants to know about it and he will not stand being served warped evaluations. He understands that the intelligence community has been bitten badly a few times and thus tends to make its reports as bland as possible so that it won't be bitten again, the minutes say. He believes that those responsible for the deliberate distortion of an intelligence report should be fired. He suggested that the time may be coming when he would have to read the Riot Act to the entire intelligence community. At this delicate moment, Nixon ordered the CIA to fix the next election in Chile.
29 personal remain.
29. USG wants a military solution. By 1970, The CIA's influence was felt in every nation in the Western Hemisphere, from the Texas border to Tierra del Fuego. In Mexico, the president dealt exclusively with the station chief, not the ambassador, and he received a personal New Year's Day briefing at his home from the Director of Central Intelligence. In Honduras, 2 successive station chiefs had privately pledged the support of the United States to the military junta, in defiance of the ambassadors they served. Few Latin American nations paid more than lip service to the ideals of democracy and the rule of law. One of the few was Chile, where the CIA saw a red threat rising. The leftist Salvador Allende was the frontrunner in the presidential election set for September 1970. The moderate Radomiro Tomic, backed by the Christian Democrats, traditional CIA favorites, looked like a very long shot. The right-winger Jorge Alessandri had a strong pro-American track record, but he was corrupt. The American ambassador, Edward Corey, found him insupportable. All bets were off. The CIA had beaten Allende once before. President Kennedy first approved a political warfare program to subvert him more than 2 years before the September 1964 Chilean elections. The agency put in the plumbing and pumped roughly $3 million into the political apparatus of Chile. It worked out to about $1 a vote for the pro-American Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei. Lyndon Johnson, who approved the continuing operation, spent a lot less per voter when he won the American presidency in 1964. Frey's campaign received get-out-the-vote drives and political consultants along with suitcases full of cash. The CIA financed covert anti-Allende efforts by the Roman Catholic Church and trade unions. The agency pumped up the resistance to Allende in the Chilean military command and the national police. Secretary of State Rusk told President Johnson that Frey's victory was a triumph for democracy, achieved partly as a result of the good work of the CIA. President Frey served for 6 years. The Constitution limited him to 1 term. Now the question once again was how to stop Allende. For months, Helms had been warning the White House that if it wanted to keep Chile under control, it needed to approve a new covert action quickly. Winning foreign elections took time as well as money. The agency had one of its most durable and dependable men posted as station chief in Santiago, Henry Heckscher, who had spied on the Soviets from Berlin, helped overthrow Guatemala, and maneuvered Laos into the American camp. Now he strongly advised the White House to back Alessandri, the right-winger. Kissinger was preoccupied. He had a real war in Southeast Asia on his hands. He famously called Chile a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. But in March 1970, he approved a $135,000 political warfare program to crush Allende. On June 27th, adding another $165,000, he observed, "I don't see why we have to let a country go Marxist just because its people are irresponsible." He backed the defeat of Allende, but the election of no one. In the spring and summer of 1970, the CIA went to work. At home and abroad, it fed propaganda to prominent reporters who served as the agency's stenographers. Particularly noteworthy in this connection was the Time cover story, which owed a great deal to written materials and briefings provided by CIA, an in-house agency report noted. In Europe, senior representatives of the Vatican and Christian democratic leaders in West Germany and Italy worked at the CIA's behest to stop Allende. In Chile, posters were printed, news stories planted, editorial comment encouraged, rumors whispered, leaflets strewn, and pamphlets distributed, Helms recounted. The goal was to terrify the electorate, to show that an Allende victory risked the destruction of Chilean democracy, Helms said. It was a strenuous effort, but the discernible effect seemed minimal. Ambassador Corey found the CIA's work appallingly unprofessional. "I had never seen such dreadful propaganda in a campaign anywhere in the world," he said many years later. "I said that the idiots in the CIA who had helped create the campaign of terror, and I said this to the CIA, should have been sacked immediately for not understanding Chile and Chileans. This was the kind of thing I had seen in 1948 in Italy. On September 4th, 1970, Allende won the three-way election by a 1.5% margin, with less than 37% of the vote. Under Chilean law, the Congress had to ratify the result and affirm Allende's plurality 50 days after the election. It was a mere legal formality. You already have your Vietnam. The CIA had plenty of experience fixing an election before the ballot. It had never fixed one afterward. It had 7 weeks to reverse the outcome. Kissinger instructed Helms to weigh the chances for a coup. They were slim. Chile had been a democracy since 1932, and the military had not sought political power since. Helms sent Station Chief Henry Heckscher a cable ordering him to establish direct contacts with Chilean military officers who could take care of Allende. Heckscher had no such connections, but he did know Agustin Edwards, one of the most powerful men in Chile. Edwards owned most of the nation's copper mines, its biggest newspaper, El Mercurio, and its Pepsi-Cola bottling plant. A week after the election, Edwards flew north to see his good friend Donald Kendall, Pepsi's chief executive officer and one of President Nixon's most valued financial supporters. On September 14th, Edwards and Kendall had coffee with Kissinger. Then, Kendall went to Nixon and wanted some help to keep Allende out of office, Helms recalled. Kendall later denied that role. Helms scoffed at the disavowal. Helms met Edwards at midday at the Washington Hilton. They discussed the timing for a military coup against Allende. That afternoon, Kissinger approved $250,000 more for political warfare in Chile. In all, the CIA delivered a total of $1.95 million directly to Edwards, El Mercurio, and their campaign against Allende. That same morning, Helms had told Tom Polgar, now the station chief in Buenos Aires, to get on the next plane for Washington and to bring along the chief of the Argentine military junta, General Alejandro Lanusse. The general was an unsentimental man who had spent 4 years in prison in the 1960s after a failed coup. The next afternoon, September 15th, Polgar and Lanusse sat in the director's suite at CIA headquarters waiting for Helms to return from a meeting with Nixon and Kissinger. Helms was very nervous when he returned, Polgar remembered, and with good reason. Nixon had ordered him to mount a military coup without telling the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the American ambassador, or the station chief. Helms had scrawled the president's commands on a notepad. 1 in 10 chance perhaps, but save Chile. $10 million available. Best men we have, make the economy scream. Helms had 48 hours to give Kissinger a game plan and 49 days to stop Allende. Tom Polgar had known Richard Helms for 25 years. They had started out together in the Berlin base in 1945. Polgar looked his old friend in the eye and saw a flicker of despair. Helms turned to General Lanusse and asked what it would take for his junta to help overthrow Allende. The Argentine general stared at the chief of American intelligence. "Mr. Helms," he said, "you already have your Vietnam. Don't make me have mine." What we need is a general with balls. On September 16th, Helms called an early morning meeting with his covert action chief, Tom Karamessines, and 7 other senior officers. The president asked the agency to prevent Allende from coming to power or to unseat him, he announced. Karamessines had overall command as well as the thankless job of keeping Kissinger posted. The CIA divided the Allende operation into Track 1
we're an
and
hour and a
Track
half
2.
in, and I'm not feeling that
Track 1
painful.
was political warfare,
Good sign.
economic pressure, propaganda, and diplomatic hardball. It aimed to buy enough votes in the Chilean Senate to block Allende's confirmation. If that failed, Ambassador Corey planned to persuade President Frey to create a constitutional coup. As a last resort, the United States would condemn Chile and the Chileans to utmost deprivation and poverty, Corey told Kissinger, forcing Allende to adopt the harsh features of a police state and provoking a popular uprising. Track 2 was a military coup. Corey knew nothing about it, but Helms defied the president's order to exclude Henry Heckscher, and he told Tom Polgar to return to Argentina to bolster him. Heckscher and Polgar, Berlin-based boys, the best of friends since World War II, were among the finest officers the CIA had. They both thought Track 2 was a fool's errand. Helms called in the station chief in Brazil, David Atlee Phillips, to lead the Chile task force. A CIA man since 1950, a veteran of Guatemala and the Dominican Republic, he was the best propaganda artist at the agency. He had no hope for Track 1. Anyone who had lived in Chile, as I had, and knew Chileans, knew that you might get away with bribing one Chilean senator, but 2, never. And 3, not a chance, he said. They would blow the whistle. They were Democrats and had been for a long time. As for Track 2, Phillips said, the Chilean military was a very model of democratic rectitude. Their commander, General René Schneider, had proclaimed that the army would obey the Constitution and refrain from politics. For Track 1, Phillips had 23 foreign reporters on his payroll to stir up international opinion. He and his colleagues had dictated the fierce anti-Allende story that ran on the cover of Time. For Track 2, he had a false flag team of deep-cover CIA men with phony passports. One posed as a Colombian businessman, another as an Argentine smuggler, a third as a Bolivian military intelligence officer. On September 27th, the false flaggers asked the U.S. Army attaché at the embassy, Colonel Paul Weiner, a longtime friend of the CIA, to help them find Chilean officers who would overthrow Allende. One of the very few generals who had tried to stir up a coup in the recent past, Roberto Villó, was a candidate. But many of his fellow officers thought Villó was a dangerous fool. Some thought he was insane. On October 6th, one of the false flaggers had a long talk with Villó. Within hours, Ambassador Corey learned for the first time that the CIA was plotting a coup behind his back. He had a screaming confrontation with Henry Heckscher. You have 24 hours to either understand that I run you or you leave the country, the ambassador said. I am appalled, Corey cabled Kissinger. Any attempt on our part actively to encourage a coup could lead us to a Bay of Pigs failure. An apoplectic Kissinger ordered the ambassador to stop meddling. Then he summoned Helms once more to the White House. The result was a flash cable to the CIA station in Santiago. Contact the military and let them know USG, the U.S. government, wants a military solution and that we will support them now and later. Create at least some sort of coup climate. Sponsor a military move. On October 7th, hours after that order left CIA headquarters, Helms took off on a 2-week inspection tour of the stations in Saigon, Bangkok, Vientiane, and Tokyo. That day, Henry Heckscher tried to knock down the idea of running a coup in concert with General Villó. The station chief told headquarters that a Villó regime would be a tragedy for Chile and for the free world. A Villó coup would only produce a massive bloodbath. That went over poorly in Washington. On October 10th, with 2 weeks left until the installation of Allende, Heckscher tried again to explain the facts to his superiors. You have asked us to provoke chaos in Chile, Heckscher wrote. Through Villó's solution, we provide you with formula for chaos which is unlikely to be bloodless. To dissimulate U.S. involvement will clearly be impossible. Station team, as you know, has given serious consideration to all plans suggested by HQ's counterparts. We conclude that none of them stand even a remote chance of achieving objective. Hence, Villó gamble, despite high risk factors, may commend itself to you. Headquarters hesitated. On October 13th, Heckscher cabled the news that Villó was thinking about kidnapping the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, the constitutionally minded General Schneider. Kissinger summoned Karamessines to the White House. On the morning of October 16th, Karamessines cabled his orders to Heckscher. It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. It was determined that a VO coup attempt carried out by him alone, with the forces now at his disposal, would fail. Encourage him to amplify his planning. Encourage him to join forces with other coup planners. Great and continuing interest in the activities of Valenzuela et al., and we wish them optimum good fortune. General Camilo Valenzuela, chief of the Santiago garrison, had been in touch with the CIA 6 days before. He had revealed that he was willing, perhaps able, but frightened. On the evening of October 16th, one of Valenzuela's officers approached the CIA looking for money and guidance. "Que necesitamos es un general con cojones," the officer said. "What we need is a general with balls." The next night, General Valenzuela sent 2 colonels to meet in secret with Colonel Weiner, the CIA's uniformed representative. Their plan, virtually identical to one first broached by VO, was to kidnap General Schneider, fly him to Argentina, dissolve Congress, and take power in the name of the armed forces. They received $50,000 cash, 3 submachine guns, and a satchel of tear gas, all approved at headquarters by Tom Karamessines. On October 19th, with 5 days to go, Heckscher pointed out that Track 2 had been so unprofessional and insecure that, in Chilean setting, it could stand a chance of succeeding. In other words, so many Chilean military officers knew that the CIA wanted Allende stopped that the odds of a coup were rising. "All interested military parties know our position," reads a CIA memo dated October 20th. Richard Helms returned to the United States from his 2-week tour of Asian stations the next day. On October 22nd, 50 hours before Congress was to convene to confirm the election results, a gang of armed men ambushed General Schneider on his way to work. He was shot repeatedly and died in surgery shortly after Salvador Allende was affirmed by Congress as the constitutionally elected president of Chile by a vote of 153 to 35. It took the CIA quite a few days to figure out who had killed General Schneider. At headquarters, Dave Phillips had assumed that the CIA's machine guns had done the job. To his great relief, it had been VO's men, not Valenzuela's, who pulled the trigger. The CIA plane, once scheduled to smuggle a kidnapped General Schneider out of Santiago, carried in his stead the Chilean officer who had received the agency's guns and money. He came to Buenos Aires with a pistol in his pocket, saying, "I'm in big trouble, you gotta help me," Tom Polgar remembered. The agency had started out buying votes in Chile, and it wound up smuggling automatic weapons to would-be assassins.
Yeah, but it's the CIA, so that's what
The
they do.
CIA isn't worth a damn. The White House was furious at the agency's failure to stop Allende. The president and his men believed that a liberal cabal at the CIA had sabotaged covert action in Chile.
Not a liberal cabal.
Alexander Haig, now a general and Kissinger's indispensable right hand, said the operation failed because the CIA's officers had let their political feelings flavor their final assessments and their proposals for remedial action in the covert area. It was high time, Haig told his boss, to purge the key left-wing dominated slots under Helms and insist on a major overhauling of the means, the attitude, and the conceptual basis on which CIA's covert programs should be carried out. Nixon decreed that Helms could keep his job only if he cleaned house. The director immediately promised to dismiss 4 of his 6 deputies, retaining only Tom Karamessines for covert action and Carl Duckett for science and technology. In a memo to Kissinger, he warned obliquely that a continuing purge would threaten the morale and dedication of his men. The president responded by threatening over and over to cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of the agency's hide. Nixon railed against the CIA and their lousy intelligence, recalled George P. Shultz, then his budget director. "I want you to cut the CIA's budget to 1/3 its present size," the president would say. "No, make it 1/2 its present size." It was Nixon's way of venting his ire, but you didn't take it too seriously. Nixon was not kidding. In December 1970, one of Kissinger's aides pleaded that you privately urged the president not to make such a large, arbitrary, across-the-board cut. A meat axe approach could be disastrous. But the president held the knife at the CIA's throat for the next 2 years. It proved simple for the Nixon White House to savage the CIA, but far harder to salvage it. That month, at the president's direction, Kissinger and Schultz deputized an ambitious axe wielder at the budget office named James R. Schlesinger to lead a 3-month review of the roles and responsibilities held by Richard Helms. Prematurely gray at 41, Schlesinger was a Harvard classmate of Kissinger's, every bit his equal in intellect, though lacking the essential quality of deceit. He had made his reputation at the Nixon White House by crashing into the underbrush of the government and chopping out dead wood. Schlesinger reported that the cost of intelligence was soaring and the quality shrinking. 7,000 CIA analysts swamped with data could not sort out the patterns of the present. 6,000 clandestine service officers could not penetrate the high councils of the communist world. The director of Central Intelligence had no power to do anything except run covert action and produce intelligence reports that Nixon and Kissinger rarely read. The agency could not support Nixon's global ambitions, opening the door to China, standing up to the Soviets, ending the Vietnam War on American terms. There is no evidence that the intelligence community, given its present structure, will come to grips with this class of problems, Schlesinger concluded. He proposed the most radical reshaping of American espionage since 1947. A new czar, to be known as the Director of National Intelligence, would work at the White House and oversee the empire of intelligence. The CIA should be dismembered and a new agency invented to carry out covert action and espionage. Haig, who had set the idea in motion, wrote a memo that it would be the most controversial gut fight undertaken in American government in memory. The problem was that Congress had created the CIA, and it would have to play a part in its rebirth.
Yeah.
This Nixon could not abide. It had to be done in secret. He ordered Kissinger to spend a month doing nothing else but making sure it happened. But Kissinger had no stomach for it. "I prefer to sit on it," he scribbled on Haig's memo. "I have no intention to bleed over it." The long battle ended a year after Allende came to power. The president directly ordered Helms to hand over control of the CIA to his deputy director, Nixon's hired gun, General Cushman, and assumed the role of figurehead emperor of American intelligence. Helms parried that deadly thrust with a deft riposte. He put Cushman in a freeze so deep that the general pleaded for a new billet as the commandant of the Marines. The number 2 job stayed open for 6 months. With that, the idea died, except in the mind of Richard Nixon. "Intelligence is a sacred cow," he raged. "We've done nothing since we've been here about it. The CIA isn't worth a damn." He made a mental note to get rid of Richard Helms. The natural and probable consequences. The subversion of Salvador Allende went on. Track 2 never really ended, the CIA's Tom Karamessian said, and his notes from a December 10, 1970 White House meeting reflected what was to come. Kissinger, in the role of the devil's advocate, pointed out that the proposed CIA program was aimed at supporting moderates. Since Allende is holding himself out as a moderate, he asked, why not support extremists? That is precisely what the agency did. It spent most of the $10 million authorized by Nixon sowing political and economic chaos in Chile. The seeds sprouted in 1971. The new chief of the Latin American division, Ted Shackley, back at CIA headquarters after chief of station stints in Laos and South Vietnam, told his superiors that his officers would bring our influence to bear on key military commanders so that they might play a decisive role on the side of the coup forces. The new Santiago station chief, Ray Warren, built a web of military men and political saboteurs who sought to shift the Chilean military off its constitutional foundation. And President Allende made a fatal mistake. In reaction to the pressure placed upon him by the CIA, he built a shadow army called the Grupo de Amigos del Presidente, or the Friends of the President. Fidel Castro backed this force. The Chilean military could not conscience it. Almost 3 years to the day after Allende's election, a young CIA officer in Santiago by the name of Jack Devine, who many years later became the acting chief of the clandestine service, flashed a bulletin that went straight to Kissinger, whom Richard Nixon had just nominated to be Secretary of State. The cable said the United States would within minutes or hours receive a request for aid from a key officer of the Chilean military group planning to overthrow President Allende. The coup came on September 11th, 1973. It was swift and terrible. Facing capture at the presidential palace, Allende killed himself with an automatic rifle, a gift from Fidel Castro. The military dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet took power that afternoon, and the CIA quickly forged a liaison with the general's junta. Pinochet reigned with cruelty, murdering more than 3,200 people, jailing and torturing tens of thousands in the repression called the Caravan of Death. There is no doubt, the agency confessed in a statement to Congress after the Cold War ended, that some CIA contacts were actively engaged in committing and covering up serious human rights abuses. Chief among them was Colonel Manuel Contreras, the head of the Chilean intelligence service under Pinochet. He became a paid CIA agent and met with senior CIA officials in Virginia 2 years after the coup, at a time when the agency reported that he was personally responsible for thousands of cases of murder and torture in Chile. Contreras distinguished himself with a singular act of terror: the 1976 assassination of Orlando Letelier, who had been Allende's ambassador to the United States, and an American aide, Ronnie Moffett. They were killed by a car bomb 14 blocks from the White House. Contreras then blackmailed the United States by threatening to tell the world about his relationship with the CIA, and blocked his extradition and trial for the murder. There was no question at the agency that Pinochet knew and approved of that terrorist killing on American soil. The Pinochet regime held power for 17 years. After it fell, Contreras was convicted by a Chilean court of the murder of Orlando Letelier and served a 7-year sentence. Pinochet died in December 2006 at age 91 under indictment for murder and with $28 million in secret bank accounts abroad.
Yep, I forgot.
At this writing, Henry Kissinger is being pursued in the courts of Chile, Argentina, Spain, and France by survivors of the Caravan of Death. When he was Secretary of State, the White House counsel gave him fair warning that one who sets in motion a coup attempt can be assessed with the responsibility for the natural and probable consequences of that action. The CIA was incapable of placing stop-and-go buttons on the machinery of covert action, said Dave Phillips, the Chilean task force chief. I thought that if there were a military coup, there might be 2 weeks of street fighting in Santiago and perhaps months of fighting and thousands of deaths in the countryside. He testified in secret to a Senate committee 5 years after the initial failure of Track 2. God knows I knew I was involved in something where one man might get killed. His interrogator asked, "What is the distinction that you draw between one death in an assassination and thousands in a coup?" "Sir," he replied, "what is the distinction I draw from the time I was a bombardier in World War II and pushed a target button and hundreds and perhaps thousands of people died. 30. We are going to catch a lot of hell. Under President Nixon, secret government surveillance reached a peak in the spring of 1971. The CIA, the NSA, and the FBI were spying on American citizens. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were using electronic eavesdropping and espionage to keep tabs on Kissinger. Nixon, improving on the work of Kennedy and Johnson, had bugged the White House and Camp David with state-of-the-art voice-activated microphones. Nixon and Kissinger wiretapped their own close aides and Washington reporters, trying to stop leaks to the press. But leaks were a spring that never failed. In June, the New York Times began publishing long excerpts from the Pentagon Papers, the secret Vietnam history commissioned by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara 4 years before. The source was Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon whiz kid whom Kissinger had hired as a consultant to the National Security Council and invited into Nixon's California compound at San Clemente. Kissinger raged at the release, sending Nixon into a greater fury. The president turned to his domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, to stop the leaks. He assembled a team called the Plumbers, led by a very recently retired CIA officer who had played prominent roles in Guatemala and the Bay of Pigs. Everett Howard Hunt, Jr., was a unique character, said Ambassador Sam Hart, who met him when Hunt was chief of station in Uruguay in the late 1950s. Totally self-absorbed, totally amoral, and a danger to himself and anybody around him. As far as I could tell, Howard went from one disaster to another, rising higher and higher, everything floating just right behind him. Hunt had been a romantic young Cold Warrior when he signed up with the CIA in 1950. He had become a fantasist who funneled his talent into writing halfway decent spy novels. He had been retired from the CIA for less than a year when a casual acquaintance, Nixon's aide Chuck Colson, offered him an exciting new assignment, running secret operations for the White House. Hunt flew down to Miami to see his old Cuban-American companion, Bernard Barker, who was selling real estate, and they talked beside a monument to the dead of the Bay of Pigs. He described the mission as national security, Barker said. I asked Howard who he represented, and the answer he gave me was really something for the books. He said he was in a group at the White House level under direct order of the President of the United States. Together, they recruited 4 more Miami Cubans, including Eugenio Martinez, who had run some 300 seagoing missions into Cuba for the CIA and remained on a $100 a month retainer from headquarters. On July 7, 1971, Ehrlichman telephoned Nixon's spy inside the CIA, the Deputy Director, General Cushman. The president's aide told him that Howard Hunt would be calling him directly and asking for assistance. I wanted you to know that he was in fact doing some things for the president, Ehrlichman said. You should consider he has pretty much carte blanche. Hunt's demands escalated. He wanted his old secretary back. He wanted an office with a secure telephone in New York. He wanted state-of-the-art tape recorders. He wanted a CIA camera to stake out a break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in Beverly Hills, and he wanted the CIA to develop the film. Cushman belatedly informed Helms that the agency had given Hunt a set of disguises, a red wig, a voice-altering device, fake personal identification. Then the White House demanded that the agency produce a psychological profile of Daniel Ellsberg, a direct violation of the CIA's charter against spying on Americans. But Helms complied. Helms pushed Cushman out of the agency in November 1971. Months went by before Nixon found the perfect candidate, Lieutenant General Vernon Walters. General Walters had been conducting secret missions for presidents for the better part of 20 years. But Helms had never met him before he arrived as the new Deputy Director of Central Intelligence on May 2, 1972. I had just come from running an operation which the CIA knew nothing about, General Walters recounted. Helms, who had wanted someone else, said, I've heard about you. What do you know about intelligence? I said, well, I've been negotiating with the Chinese and the Vietnamese for 3 years, and I smuggled Henry Kissinger into Paris 15 times without you or anybody else in the agency knowing anything about it. Helms was duly impressed, but he soon had cause to wonder about his new deputy's loyalties. Every tree in the forest will fall. Late on Saturday night, June 17, 1972, Howard Osborne, the chief of the CIA's Office of Security, called Helms at home. The director knew it could not be good news. This is how he remembered the conversation. "Dick, are you still up?" "Yes, Howard." "I've just learned that the district police have picked up 5 men in a break-in at the Democratic Party national headquarters at the Watergate. 4 Cubans and Jim McCord."
Something Gate was born.
McCord? Retired out of your shop? 2 years ago. What about the Cubans? Miami or Havana? Miami. In this country for some time now. Do we know them? As of now, I can't say. Get hold of the operations people, first thing. Have them get on to Miami. Check every record here and in Miami. Is that all of it? No, not half, Osborne said heavily. Howard Hunt also seems to be involved. Hearing Hunt's name, Helms drew a deep breath. What the hell were they doing, he asked. He had a fair idea. McCord was an expert in electronic eavesdropping. Hunt was working for Nixon, and the charge was wiretapping, a federal crime.
Yep.
Sitting on the edge of his bed, Helms tracked down the acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, at a hotel in Los Angeles. J. Edgar Hoover had died 6 weeks before, after 48 years in power. Helms told Gray very carefully that the Watergate burglars had been hired by the White House, and the CIA had nothing to do with it. Got that? Okay. Good night, then. Helms convened the daily 9 a.m. meeting of senior CIA officers at headquarters on Monday, June 19th. Bill Colby, now the CIA's executive director, the number 3 man, remembered Helms saying, "We are going to catch a lot of hell because these are formers, that is, former CIA men, and we knew they were working in the White House." The next morning, the Washington Post placed the responsibility for Watergate at the door of the Oval Office, although to this day no one really knows if Richard Nixon authorized the break-in. On Friday, June 23rd, Nixon told his brutally efficient chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to call Helms and Walters into the White House and order them to wave off the FBI in the name of national security. They agreed to play ball at first, a very dangerous business. Walters called Gray and told him to stand down. But a line was crossed on Monday, June 26th, when Nixon's counsel, John Dean, ordered Walters to come up with a large sum of untraceable hush money for the 6 jailed CIA veterans. On Tuesday, Dean repeated the demand. He later told the president that the price of silence would be $1 million over 2 years. Only Helms, or Walters, when Helms was outside the United States, could authorize a secret payment from the CIA's black budget. They were the only officials in the American government who could legally deliver a suitcase with $1 million in secret cash to the White House, and Nixon knew it. We could get money any place in the world, Helms reflected. We ran a whole arbitrage operation. We didn't need to launder money ever. But if the CIA delivered the cash, the end result would have been the end of the agency, he said. Not only would I have gone to jail if I had gone along with what the White House wanted us to do, but the agency's credibility would have been ruined forever. Helms refused. Then, on June 28th, he fled Washington for a 3-week tour of intelligence outposts in Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, leaving Walters as the acting director. A week went by. Impatient FBI agents started to rebel against their orders to stand down. Gray told Walters he would need an order in writing from the CIA calling off the investigation on national security grounds. Both men now understood the risks of a paper trail. They spoke on July 6th, and shortly thereafter, Gray called the president at his retreat in San Clemente. "People on your staff are trying to mortally wound you by manipulating the CIA," he told Nixon. An awful silence followed. And then the president told Gray to go ahead with the investigation. Shortly after Helms returned from his trip in late July, Jim McCord, awaiting trial and facing 5 years in prison, sent a message through his lawyer to the CIA. He said the president's men wanted him to testify that the Watergate break-in was an agency operation. "Let the CIA take the rap," a White House aide told him, and the presidential pardon would follow. McCord responded in a letter, "If Helms goes and the Watergate operation is laid at CIA's feet where it does not belong, every tree in the forest will fall. It will be a scorched desert. The whole matter is at the precipice right now. Pass the message that if they want it to blow, they are on exactly the right course." Everyone knew we were in for a bad time. On November 7, 1972,
America got off pretty
President
good.
Nixon was re-elected in one of the great landslides of American history. He vowed that day to run the CIA and the State Department with an iron hand in his second term, to destroy them and rebuild them in his image. On November 9th, Kissinger proposed replacing Helms with James Schlesinger, then the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. "Very good idea," Nixon responded. On November 13th, he told Kissinger that he intended to ruin the Foreign Service. "I mean ruin it, the old Foreign Service, and to build a new one. I'm going to do it." He settled on an inside man to do the job, the OSS veteran and champion Republican fundraiser William J. Casey. In 1968, Casey had importuned President-elect Nixon to make him Director of Central Intelligence, but Nixon handed him the chair at the Securities and Exchange Commission instead, a cunning decision that cheered corporate boardrooms across America. Now, in Nixon's second term, Casey would be named Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, but his real assignment was to serve as Nixon's saboteur, to tear up the department, Nixon said. On November 20th, Nixon fired Richard Helms in a short, awkward meeting at Camp David. He offered him the post of ambassador to the Soviet Union. There was an uncomfortable pause as Helms considered the ramifications. "Look, Mr. President, I don't think that would be a very good idea to send me to Moscow," Helms said. "Well, maybe not," Nixon replied. Helms proposed Iran instead, and Nixon urged him to take it. They also reached an understanding that Helms would stay on until March 1973, his 60th birthday, the formal retirement age at the CIA. Nixon broke that pledge, a pointless act of cruelty. "The man was a shit," Helms said, faintly shaking with rage as he told the story. Helms believed to his dying day that Nixon fired him because he wouldn't take a dive on Watergate. But the record shows that Nixon resolved long before the break-in to jettison Helms and gut the CIA. The president actually believed that Helms was out to get him. "Do you think there was or could have been a CIA conspiracy to remove you from office?" Nixon's friend and former aide Frank Gannon asked him a decade later. "Many people think so," Nixon responded. "The CIA had motive. It was no secret that I was dissatisfied with the CIA, with its reports, and particularly with their appraisals of Soviet strength and our other problems around the world. I wanted to get rid of some of the deadwood and so forth, and they knew it. So they had a motive." "Do you think they feared you?" Gannon asked. "No question about it," Nixon replied, "and they had reason to." On November 21st, Nixon offered the CIA to James Schlesinger, who accepted the president's offer with pleasure. Nixon was gratified to put his own man in, one that really had RN tattooed on him, which was Schlesinger, Helms said. Schlesinger's orders, like Casey's at State, were to turn the place inside out. "Get rid of the clowns," the president kept commanding. "What use are they? They've got 40,000 people over there reading newspapers." On December 27th, the president dictated a memo laying out the mission. Though Kissinger wanted dominion over American intelligence, Schlesinger must be the man in charge, Nixon said. If Congress ever got the impression that the president has turned all intelligence activities over to Kissinger, all hell will break loose. If, on the other hand, I name the new director of CIA, Schlesinger, as my top assistant for intelligence activities, we can get it by the Congress. Henry simply doesn't have the time. I have been bugging him and Haig for over 3 years to get intelligence reorganized with no success whatever. It was a strong echo of Eisenhower's final burst of anger at the end of his presidency, his fuming at his 8-year defeat in his battle to whip American intelligence into shape. In his last days in office, Helms feared that Nixon and his loyalists would ransack the CIA's files. He did everything in his power to destroy 2 sets of secret documents that could have ruined the agency. One was the paper trail of the mind control experiments with LSD and many other drugs that he and Allen Dulles had personally approved 2 decades before. Very few of those records survived. The second was his own set of secret tapes. Helms had recorded hundreds of conversations in his executive office on the 7th floor during the 6 years and 7 months that he had served as Director of Central Intelligence. By the date of his official departure on February 2, 1973, every one had been destroyed. When Helms left the building, all the troops jammed the headquarters entrance for his departure, said Sam Halpern, then the top aide at the clandestine service. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Everyone knew we were in for a bad time after that.
Oh, I feel so bad for you.
31. To change the concept of a secret service. The collapse of the CIA as a secret intelligence service began on the day Helms left and James Schlesinger arrived at headquarters. Schlesinger spent 17 weeks as Director of Central Intelligence. In that time, he purged more than 500 analysts and more than 1,000 people from the clandestine service. Officers serving overseas received unsigned coded cables informing them that they were fired. In response, he received anonymous death threats, and he added armed guards to his security detail. He named Bill Colby as the new chief of the clandestine service, and then he sat him down to explain that it was time to change the concept of a
George
secret
Bush
service.
Sr. to show up.
The dawn of technocracy had arrived, and the day of the old boys who had been at the game for 25 years was done. He was hyper-suspicious of the role and influence of the clandestine operators, Colby recounted. He felt the agency had become complacent and bloated under their domination, that indeed there were far too many of these old boys around the place doing little more than looking after each other, playing spy games, and reliving the halcyon past. The old boys argued that every aspect of the CIA's work overseas was part of the struggle against the Soviets and the Red Chinese. Whether you were in Cairo or Kathmandu, you were always fighting Moscow and Beijing. But when Nixon and Kissinger clinked glasses with the leaders of the communist world, what was the point? Peace was at hand. The president's policy of détente was sapping the Cold War elan of the clandestine service. Colby quickly undertook a survey of the CIA's capabilities. A decade before, half the CIA's budget had gone to covert operations. Under Nixon, that figure now was falling below 10%. The recruitment of new talent was flagging, and the war in Vietnam was the cause. The political climate was not conducive to the hiring of bright young college graduates. An increasing number of campuses barred CIA recruiters by popular demand.
Yep.
The end of the military draft meant a halt to the processions of junior officers rotating into the CIA's ranks.
Future recruits.
The Soviet Union remained close to terra incognita for American spies. North Korea and North Vietnam were blanks. The CIA bought its best information from Allied foreign intelligence services and from Third World leaders whom it owned outright. It was most effective on the peripheries of power, but those were the cheap seats with obstructed views of the global stage. The Soviet division was still paralyzed by the conspiracy theories of Jim Angleton, who remained in charge of American counterintelligence. Angleton devastated us, said the CIA's Haviland Smith, who ran operations against the Soviet target in the 1960s and 1970s. He took us out of the Soviet business. One of Bill Colby's many unhappy duties was to figure out what to do with the alcoholic spy catcher who now had arrived at the conclusion that Colby himself was a mole for Moscow. Colby tried to persuade Schlesinger to fire Angleton. The new director demurred after he got the briefing. In his dark and smoky office, Angleton took the new boss on a 50-year trip, back to the beginnings of Soviet communism, into the elaborate sting operations and political manipulations that the Russians ran against the West in the 1920s and 1930s, through the communist double-agent operations and disinformation campaigns of the 1940s and 1950s, winding up with the surmise that the CIA itself had been penetrated at or near the highest levels by Moscow in the 1960s. In short, the enemy had breached the CIA defense and burrowed deep within. Schlesinger bought the briefing, entranced by Angleton's guided tour of hell. Outside the legislative charter of this agency, Schlesinger said he saw the CIA as the Central Intelligence Agency, small c, small I, small a. It had become nothing more than some component of the NSC staff under Kissinger. He intended to hand it over to Deputy Director Vernon Walters while he dealt with the spy satellites of the National Reconnaissance Office, the electronic eavesdropping colossus of the National Security Agency, and the military reports of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He intended to serve in the role he had imagined in his report to the President, as the Director of National Intelligence. But his grand ambitions were shattered by the high crimes and misdemeanors of the White House. The Watergate affair began to take over almost everything else, Schlesinger said, and the desires that I had at the outset gradually were inundated by simply the necessity of protecting, arranging for the salvation of the agency. He had an unusual sense of how to save it. Schlesinger thought that he had been told everything that the agency knew about Watergate. He was shocked when Howard Hunt testified that he and his plumbers had ransacked Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office with the technical assistance of the CIA. A review by the agency of its own files turned up a copy of the film it had developed for Hunt after he cased the office. Further review disclosed the letters to the CIA from Jim McCord, which could be read as a threat to blackmail the President of the United States. Bill Colby had jumped behind enemy lines with the OSS. He had spent 6 years supervising the killing of communists in Vietnam. He was not easily impressed by merely verbal violence, but he found Schlesinger's rage awesome. Fire everyone if you have to, the director ordered. Tear the place apart, rip out the floorboards, uncover everything. Then Schlesinger drafted a memo to every employee of the CIA. The note was one of the most dangerous decisions a director of Central Intelligence had ever made. It was the legacy he chose to leave. I have ordered all senior operating officials of this agency to report to me immediately on any activities now going on or that have gone on in the past, which might be construed to be outside the legislative charter of this agency. I hereby direct every person presently employed by CIA to report to me on any such activities of which he has knowledge. I invite all ex-employees to do the same. Anyone who has such information should call and say that he wishes to tell me about activities outside CIA's charter. The CIA's exceedingly vague charter was clear on one point. The agency could not be the American secret police. Yet, over the course of the Cold War, the CIA had been spying on citizens, tapping their telephones, opening first-class mail, and conspiring to commit murder on orders from the White House. Schlesinger's order was dated May 9, 1973, and effective immediately. That same day, Watergate began to destroy Richard Nixon. He had been forced to fire his palace guard, and only General Alexander Haig, the new White House Chief of Staff, remained. Hours after the order was issued, Haig called Colby to inform him that the Attorney General was resigning. The Secretary of Defense was taking his job. Schlesinger was leaving the CIA for the Pentagon, and the president wanted Colby to be the next director of Central Intelligence. The government was in such disarray that Colby was not sworn in until September. For 4 months, General Walters was the acting director and Colby the director designate, an awkward state of affairs.
Much else?
Colby was now 53 years old, with 30 years behind him in the OSS and the CIA. He had been an avatar of covert action all his adult life. Throughout the spring of 1973, he had been forced to serve as Schlesinger's hitman, summoning his fellow officers and handing them their walking papers. In the midst of all this, his eldest daughter, in her mid-20s, had wasted away and died from anorexia.
Jesus.
On May 21st, Colby sat down and began to read the initial compilation of the crimes of the CIA, which eventually ran to 693 potential violations. The Senate's public hearings on the Watergate case had opened that week. The news of Nixon and Kissinger's wiretapping of aides and reporters broke. The appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate the crimes of Watergate was announced. All his life, Colby had been a deeply devoted Roman Catholic, a man who believed in the consequences of mortal sin.
Right.
He now learned for the first time that day of the
time.
plots against Fidel Castro and the central role of Robert F. Kennedy,
Now, do I wrap
the
it up?
mind control experiments and the secret
keep
prisons
going
and the
for
drug tests on unwitting
at least another
human
half
guinea
hour.
pigs. The CIA's wiretapping and surveillance of citizens and reporters did not offend his conscience. Clear orders from 3 presidents stood behind them. But he knew, given the tenor of the times, that if these secrets leaked, the agency could be ruined. Colby locked them up and set about trying to run the CIA. The White House was falling apart under the crushing weight of Watergate, and it sometimes seemed to Colby that the CIA was crumbling too. It was often a good thing that Nixon did not read the intelligence the agency provided him. When the holy days of Yom Kippur and Ramadan coincided in 1973, Egypt went to war against Israel and drove deep into Israeli-held territory. In striking contrast to its solid forecasts of the Six-Day War in 1967, the CIA had misread the gathering storm. "We did not cover ourselves with glory," Colby said. "We predicted the day before the war broke out that it was not going to break out." The agency had assured the White House a few hours before the war
CIA
began,
sucks.
"Exercises are more realistic than usual, but there will be no war." 32. A classic fascist ideal. On March 7, 1973, President Nixon met in the Oval Office with Tom Pappas, a Greek-American business magnate, political fixer, and friend of the CIA. Pappas had delivered $549,000 in cash to the 1968 Nixon campaign as a gift from the leaders of the Greek military junta. The money had been laundered through the KYP, the Greek intelligence service. It was one of the darker secrets of the Nixon White House. Pappas now had hundreds of thousands of dollars more to offer the president. Money to buy the silence of the CIA veterans jailed in the Watergate break-in. Nixon thanked him profusely. "I am aware of what you're doing to help out," he said. Most of it came from members and supporters of the Colonels, the Greek junta that seized power in April 1967, led by George Papadopoulos, a recruited CIA agent since the days of Allen Dulles, and the KYP's liaison to the agency. "These colonels had been plotting for years and years," said Robert Keeley, later the American ambassador to Greece. "They were fascists. They fitted the classic definition of fascism as represented by Mussolini in the 1920s. A corporate state, uniting industry and unions, no parliament, trains running on time, heavy discipline and censorship. Almost a classic fascist ideal."
Metaxas.
Greek military and intelligence officers had worked in concert with 7 successive station chiefs in Athens. They had a great friend in Thomas Hercules Karamessians, the Greek-American chief of the clandestine service under Richard Helms. And they always had believed that the Central Intelligence Agency was an effective and relatively direct route into the White House, said Norbert Anschutz, the ranking American diplomat in Athens during the 1967 coup. Yet the colonels had taken the CIA by surprise. The only time I saw Helms really angry was when the Greek colonel's coup took place in 1967, said the veteran analyst and current intelligence chief Dick Lemon. The Greek generals had been planning a coup against the elected government, a plan we all knew about. A plan we knew all about and was not yet ripe. But a group of colonels had trumped their ace and acted without warning. Helms had been expecting to be warned of the general's coup, and when a coup occurred, he naturally assumed it was this one, and he was furious. Lemon, who had read the overnight cables from Athens, tried to cool Helms off by pointing out that this was a different coup, which we had no line on. This was a new thought. Official American policy toward the colonels was cool and distant until the inauguration of Richard Nixon in January 1969. The junta used Tom Pappas, who had been working with the CIA in Athens for 20 years, as a courier to slip cash into the political coffers of Nixon and Vice President Spiro Agnew, the most powerful Greek American in the history of the United States. The payoff reaped benefits. Agnew came to Athens on an official visit. So did the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Commerce. The United States sold tanks, aircraft, and artillery to the junta. The CIA's Athens station argued that the arms sales to the colonels would bring them back to democracy, said Archer K. Blood, a political officer at the American Embassy. That was a lie, Blood said, but if you said anything critical about the junta, the CIA would explode in anger. By 1973, the United States was the only nation in the developed world on friendly terms with the junta, which jailed and tortured its political foes. The CIA station chief was in bed with the guys who were beating up the Greeks, said Charles Stewart Kennedy, the American consul general in Athens. I would raise issues of what would amount to human rights, and this would be discounted by the CIA. The agency was too close to the wrong people, Kennedy said. It seemed to have undue influence over the ambassador, an old friend of Richard Nixon's named Henry Tasca. In the spring of 1974, General Dimitrios Ioannidis took over as the leader of the junta. He had been working with the CIA for 22 years. The agency was Ioannidis' sole contact with the government of the United States. The ambassador and the American diplomatic establishment were out of the loop. Jim Potts, the CIA station chief, was the American government insofar as the junta was concerned. The agency had a major asset in Athens. They had a relationship with the guy who ran the country, and they didn't want it disturbed, said the State Department's Thomas Boyat, the Washington desk officer responsible for Cyprus. This book is continued on Disc 12. Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner, continued. Disc 12. Conned by a pissant general. Cyprus, an island 40 miles off the coast of Turkey and 500 miles from Athens, had been divided and conquered by Greek and Islamic armies since the days of the Prophet Muhammad. The Greek colonels had a deep hatred for the Cypriot leader, Archbishop Makarios, and an abiding desire to overthrow him. The American deputy chief of mission in Cyprus, William Crawford, had gotten wind of their scheming. I went up to Athens with what I considered proof positive that they were going to pull the whole house of cards down, he remembered. I was told by our chief of station in Athens, Jim Potts, that that was just absolutely impossible. He couldn't agree with me. These people were friends with whom we'd worked for 30 years, and they would never conduct anything so foolish. By 1974, Tom Boyat became convinced that the CIA's friends in Athens wanted to do away with Makarios. He drafted a cable to Ambassador Tasca in Athens. Go talk to General Ioannidis, it said. Tell him, in words of one syllable that even he will understand, that the United States strongly opposes any efforts by any element of the Greek government, overt or clandestine, to mess around in the Cyprus situation. Tell him that we particularly oppose any efforts to overthrow Makarios and install a pro-Athens government, because if that happens, the Turks are going to invade, and that's not good for any of us. But Ambassador Tasca had never spoken to General Ioannidis in his life. That role was reserved for the CIA station chief. On Saturday, July 12, 1974, the State Department received a cable from the CIA station in Athens. Rest assured, it said, the general and the junta were not doing anything to overthrow Archbishop Makarios. So, all right, we'd had it from the horse's mouth, Boyat recounted. I went home, and about 3 a.m. on Monday morning, I got a call from the Ops Center at the State Department, and the person said, "You better get in here." The junta had attacked. Boyat rushed to the State Department, where a communications officer laid 2 pieces of paper in front of him. One was the CIA's intelligence brief for President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger. "We have been assured by General Ioannidis that Greece will not move its forces on Cyprus." The other was a cable from the American embassy in Cyprus. "The presidential palace is in flames. The Cypriot force has been decimated." From Ankara came a flash that the Turkish forces had mobilized. 2 NATO armies, the Greeks and the Turks, both trained and armed by the United States, were about to go to war with American weapons. The Turks hit the beach in northern Cyprus and cut the island in half with American tanks and artillery. There was a great slaughter of Greek Cypriots in the Turkish sector and a great slaughter of Turkish Cypriots in the Greek sector of the island. All through July, the CIA reported that the Greek army and the Greek people were solidly in support of General Ioannidis. After the battle for Cyprus was joined, the Greek junta fell. The CIA's failure to warn Washington about the war was an unusual case. There had been many such failures in the agency's annals from the Korean War onward. In 1974 alone, a leftist military coup in Portugal and a nuclear test in India had come as complete surprises. But this was different. The CIA was in bed with the military men against whom it was supposed to warn. "There we were," Boyat said years later, "sitting there with the entire intelligence establishment of the United States in all of its majesty,
Not what I had in mind,
having
but
been conned by a pissant Greek brigadier general."
Oh, he fucked up the line.
The terrible price. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned. The final blow was his admission that he had ordered the CIA to obstruct justice in the name of national security. The next day, Secretary of State Kissinger read an extraordinary message from Tom Boyat. It said the CIA had been lying about what it had been doing in Athens, deliberately misleading the American government, and those lies had helped start the war consuming Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, a war in which thousands died. The next week, gunfire broke out around the American embassy in Cyprus, and Ambassador Roger P. Davies was killed by a bullet that tore his heart out. In Athens, hundreds of thousands of people marched on the American embassy.
Queen's hat.
Demonstrators tried to set the building on fire. The newly arrived ambassador there was Jack Kubish, a veteran diplomat of broad experience, personally selected by Kissinger on the day that Nixon resigned. He requested a new station chief, and the CIA sent Richard Welch, who had learned his Greek at Harvard and had served as chief in Peru and Guatemala. Welch took up residence in the mansion where every one of his predecessors had lived. The address was widely known. It was a very serious problem, Ambassador Kubish said. I had made arrangements for him to go into a different residence and to live in a different part of town, to try to help conceal who he was and to give him some cover. Given the anti-American fervor in Athens, that seemed prudent. But neither Welch nor his wife seemed to be at all concerned about this, he said.
Anyway.
They just didn't think that in Athens there was any real severe threat to them. Welch and his wife went to a Christmas party at the ambassador's residence, just a few blocks from the CIA's mansion in the hills. When they returned home, a small car with 4 people in it was waiting in the driveway. 3 of them forced the station chief out of his car. They fired 3 slugs from a .45 into his chest and killed him, Ambassador Kubish said. They got into their car and sped off. It was the first time in the history of the CIA that a station chief had been assassinated, but it was part of a pattern of the past. Ambassador Kubish said that he had seen in Athens for the first time in his life the terrible price the U.S. government must pay when it associates itself so intimately with a repressive regime.
Well, duh.
Part of the cost was the consequence of letting the CIA shape the foreign policy of the United States.
That'll do.
33. The CIA would be destroyed. Let me start by mentioning a problem we have concerning the use of classified material. President Gerald R. Ford said as he opened one of his first National Security Council meetings in the White House Cabinet Room on October 7, 1974.
Hey,
The survivors of Watergate,
that's Jimmy Carter,
Secretary of State Kissinger, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence Walters, and the ambitious and influential White House staffer Donald Rumsfeld were enraged by the latest leak. The United States was preparing to ship billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel and Egypt. The newspapers had printed the Israeli shopping list and the American response. This is intolerable, Ford said. I have discussed several options for how to deal with it with Don Rumsfeld. The president wanted a plan within 48 hours on how to stop the press from printing what it knew. We don't have the tools we need, Schlesinger warned him. We need an official secrets act, he said. But the present climate is bad for this sort of thing. The power of secrecy had been undone by the lies of presidents, told in the name of national security of the United States.
2.5 hours.
The U-2 was a weather plane. America would not invade Cuba. Our ships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yes, all these things are true. More CIA shenanigans. And I guess I got the Lost Patrol done, and I did some busy work. I'm actually going to do Nick next week. But yeah, this was good. And I'm very happy with myself, the way I can sit here even longer than normal. So what I'm going to do now is what I always do. I will wrap this up and download this video, then upload it tomorrow, which will be at any time I feel like. That'll be over on YouTube. As for next time you'll see me, will be either Thursday or Friday to do either Yakuza or Cyberpunk. Probably Cyberpunk. Then next time we're here doing this will be next week, next Monday. Monday is I always try to make Monday the Legacy of Ashes. Well, it's right now Legacy of Ashes. The book, the audio book, the Empire of Dirt, words. If you're wondering, we are currently in the book 2 hours and 43 minutes and 24 seconds out of a 9 hour, 58 minute and 15 seconds book. So we've got about a quarter of it done. Link to part 2, which is what we're listening to now, will be in the doobly-doo for YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And also be sure to check out the links down below. And if you're watching this on Twitch, be sure to follow me over there. Join our Discord. Blue Sky. Nude. Boobies. Boobies. Maybe some boobies. That'd be kind of cool. On Discord, if you're 18 plus, yes, there will be. I don't know. Next time I will stream at all will be on Tuesday, and that will be the workout stream. Probably do it later in the day than 3 o'clock in the morning. So for the next few hours, I guess I will just vibe. Ironically enough, I probably will do some workout. Just standard workout, nothing crazy. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. It's very chill. I like doing this. It's very chill. But yeah, well, that's it. Take care. See ya. Bye. Work out if you got a sciatica. It helps.